Hey friends, welcome. Tonight, we are stepping into a world where sleep was not a struggle. A world where people rested not in silence, but in rhythm, with the wind, the fire, and each other. This is the Viking night. And for the next while, we are not just talking about it, we are living in it. So before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if these slow, quiet histories help you rest. Let me know in the comments what time it is for you right now, and where in the world you are listening from. It is always beautiful to see how many of us are falling asleep under the same sky. Now dim the lights. Maybe crack a window, or turn on a small fan for that soft hum behind the voice. Let the day fall away. And come with me, into a world where sleep was shared, trusted, and sacred. Where people rested not when they were finished, but when the night said so. Let us begin. The sun in Viking lands did not set politely. It dropped, sudden and sullen, behind low hills and sharper sea cliffs, leaving the world in a hush of deep, colorless cold. By the time the fire crackled in the longhouse, the wind was already whispering across the roofs. Inside, though, the night did not feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. Sleep came early in the north. Not because people were lazy, but because the world itself told them to rest. The dark was longer. The labor was harder. And the longhouse, packed with breath and body and firelight, was one of the few places where time could loosen its grip. There, night pressed against the wood like a second roof, heavy and still, but not unwelcome. You did not live alone. Not in this world. The longhouse was home to the entire family, parents, children, sometimes grandparents, perhaps even a laborer or two. In the farthest corners, goats might settle in for warmth. And though the air was thick with wool and wood smoke, it was also rich with the rhythm of life preparing for sleep. Each movement, from the folding of a blanket to the last wooden spoon returned to its hook, was part of a practiced ritual. Furs were laid across the floor, layered over hay. Woolen blankets were pulled from walls and corners. There were no pillows, only rolled cloaks or folded arms. But even these felt like luxury after a day of chopping, grinding, fishing, rowing. Muscles ached, eyes stung from smoke, hands were dry from rope and cold water. No one needed convincing. The body knew it was time. Outside, the world turned brittle. Inside, it pulsed low and steady. Voices quieted. Movements slowed. Children curled next to the warmest sides of the room, pressed between parents, or tucked against dogs. A bowl of broth might still steam in someone's hands, thick with barley and bone. Its warmth traveled from palm to belly, then deeper. Bellies filled with root vegetables and dried fish settled into stillness. The fire was not just warmth, it was rhythm. Every hiss, every pop, every long exhale of smoke into the rafters marked another moment between waking and sleep. People rarely spoke once they lay down. They listened. To wind. To fire. To the creak of wood settling in cold. And, most of all, to each other. A child's whisper could carry across the room like prayer. An old man's cough might echo as memory. The longhouse did not have silence, but it had peace. Sleep was not an isolated act. It was shared. Breath by breath, weight by weight. When one child stirred, a mother's hand moved to settle them. When a father snored, someone gently rolled him to the side. There was no shame in noise. Only rhythm. Only rest. And in the collective hush, even restlessness found comfort. The bedding was never even. One night you might lie closer to the fire. The next farther away. Sleep was passed like bread, not always equal, but always offered. If you were lucky, a fur that did not itch. If you were tired enough, even a straw mat felt like heaven. The scent of pine needles beneath wool, the crunch of dry straw, became lullabies of their own. Dreams were not private things. In the morning, they were shared, weighed for meaning, traded like coins. A raven in a dream could mean fortune or warning. A wolf could mean strength or hunger. But in the night, dreams came freely. They slipped in with the smoke and curled beside the sleepers like curious spirits. Elders told stories of dreams that predicted storms, births, or death. There was no clock. No ticking. Time was counted by firewood burned and breaths taken. Sleep began when it was dark enough. When the body gave in. When the voices lowered. Sometimes, when the story ended. The darkness outside was absolute, and so the glow within became a kind of clock, a slow rhythm measured in glowing embers. Because before sleep came story. Not read from books, but spoken, passed down through mouth and memory. A tale of Thor's hammer, or the ghost who wandered the fjord, or the boy who outran winter. Stories were not entertainment. They were insulation. They wrapped the mind the way furs wrap the feet. Warm. Familiar. Trusted. And if the voice trembled, it did not matter. The story was the warmth. And so the night stretched. Not with urgency, but with softness. The kind of stretch a cat makes before curling tighter. The kind of stretch that makes room for every yawn, every breath, every flicker of memory. There was no need to rush. The cold would wait. The morning would not come any faster. Some nights, sleep came in pieces. The first deep wave. Then a waking, to stoke the fire, to soothe a restless child, to shift your weight. And then sleep again. There was no pressure to rest in a perfect block. No guilt in waking. The house breathed. The people inside it breathed with it. Sleep was elastic, generous, forgiving. The cold outside sharpened. But it did not enter. Not when there were so many bodies, so many breaths. Wool, smoke, fire, flesh. These were the walls of night. These were the things that kept death a little farther away. These were the tools of survival, but also of peace. The dogs shifted in their sleep, sighing into the floor. Someone murmured. A baby nursed, half asleep. The longhouse held all of it. It did not judge. It simply listened. And in that listening, sleep became something more than function. It became sanctuary. And as eyes closed, slowly, without push, the world became smaller. Not poorer. Not dimmer. Just closer. As if every dream waited at the edge of the firelight, ready to slip inside and curl up until morning. As if the darkness had hands, and those hands were gentle. This was where Viking sleep began. Not in silence. Not in solitude. But in warmth. In rhythm. In a house that held the dark gently and let it settle like dust. Here, the night was not an absence. It was a fullness. Tomorrow would come with frost and work and voices rising. The axe, the rope, the sea, the stone. But tonight was fire and fur. And the long, deep breath of a world that knew how to rest. A world where sleep did not have to be earned. It simply came, and was welcomed like an old friend. A world where the fire never truly died, it only waited for morning. The Viking longhouse was never quiet in the way we imagine silence. It was never still in the way we now chase calm. But it was, in its own way, a home sculpted by necessity, and necessity knew how to rest. Made from thick timbers, sod, and earth, the longhouse was not elegant, but it was enduring. The walls held not just heat, but history, smoke-darkened beams, layers of soot, the breath of 100 winters. The roof was made of thatch or turf, sometimes both. It was heavy and sloped and thick, designed not to impress but to survive. Rain might drum across it. Snow might settle on it. But neither came inside. At night that mattered. Because the Viking house was not simply a shelter. It was a womb of warmth. A cradle in the cold. It was the place the day ended and the body could give in. Inside those walls, the wind might scream, but it did so from far away. The fire was at the center. Always. It burned long after meals were done, fed in turns by whomever stirred. The smoke curled upward, escaping through a small hole in the roof or lingering just below the rafters. The smell of it was in everything, in cloaks, in beards, in sleep itself. Around the fire, the family laid out their night. Not on beds. Not on frames. But on the floor, fur layered over straw, straw over earth. Some might have boards beneath them, lifted slightly off the ground. Most did not. What mattered was not elevation. It was heat. The body did not rise. It gathered. Woolen blankets were shared. Furs traded hands. There were few that belonged to just one person. Warmth, like story, like labor, was communal. The mother might share her blanket with 3 children. A grandfather might sleep pressed against the family dog. In winter, it was not rare to wake in a tangle of limbs and cloaks and dreams. Clothing stayed on. No one stripped down for sleep. You kept on your tunic, your hose, your socks if you had them. Hats were common. Wool caps drawn over ears, braided hair wrapped tight to keep heat near the scalp. Cold was not an enemy, exactly. But it was always outside the door, waiting. Shoes came off and were placed near the fire, not for comfort, but so they would not freeze. Tools were leaned nearby, not because of fear, but out of habit. A knife, a fire poker, maybe an axe. These were not weapons of war. They were tools of daily life: bread, firewood, water. The house settled slowly. Sounds faded in layers. First the voice. Then the movement. Then the fire's loudest crackles gave way to its softest murmurs. The sound of someone turning. A child's breath caught in a dream. A sigh from a wife who had worked her arms sore kneading dough. The longhouse became a body. And everyone inside it, a heartbeat. Outside, the world did what it would. Wind through trees. Rain in the thatch. The distant call of a fox. These sounds were not distractions. They were reminders. That life continued. That the wild was near. But also that you were not out there. You were inside. You were held. Walls were lined with tools and baskets, bundles of herbs, rows of smoked fish. There were no bedside tables. No lanterns. No books to read before sleep. But there were objects that knew rest: a spindle left half-wound, a bowl crusted from dinner, a comb with hair still tangled in its teeth. These were the marks of people who paused, not for leisure, but for necessity. The children learned early how to fall asleep with noise. With stories being told. With the smell of sweat and soup. With the shifting of dogs and the cough of elders. There was no such thing as the perfect sleep environment. There was only what worked. In the farthest corners, sometimes, animals shared space. A goat. A sheep. A hen or two in winter. Their warmth was welcome. Their breath rhythmic. Their smell part of the home. The idea of cleanliness was different. Not less valued, just measured differently. Sleep did not wait for linen. It arrived in wool and smoke. The hearth's glow dimmed through the night. Orange to amber. Amber to gray. And still the house breathed. If a log was added, it was done in silence. If a baby cried, it was soothed quickly, gently. No one was scolded for waking. No one apologized for shifting. Sleep was not a ceremony. It was a rhythm. The door stayed barred, but not bolted. If someone came, they would knock. If snow drifted high, the cold would climb the walls. But the people inside, they stayed still. They stayed folded into themselves and one another. Sleep was not something chased. It was something accepted. There were no sleep schedules. No alarms. You rose when the light came. Or when the rooster crowed. Or when the elder called for help with the kettle. Time was told by the sun and the season and the size of the fire. And when you woke, it was not with a jolt. It was with a shift. A slow peeling away of the blanket. A foot meeting cold floor. A blink toward the smoke hole above. But that was later. Now, there was nothing to do. Nothing to prepare. Nothing to fix. Now, there was only warmth. And wool. And the breath of others sleeping beside you. Now, there was only sleep. And the home built to hold it. The Viking body was not soft. It did not live in chairs or recline on cushions. It bent, lifted, carried, pulled. It held weight and gave warmth. It rose early, without permission, and did not rest until the sun had slipped far past the trees. But when it did rest, truly rest, it did so without apology. It did not need persuasion. It simply yielded. From the moment the sun appeared, the day had demands. The farm did not wait. The goats bleated whether or not your eyes had opened. The frost on the water bucket did not soften for you. You rose because you had to. The firewood had to be split. The bread had to be made. The fish had to be cleaned. Even the youngest among them knew what it meant to begin before one was ready. Labor was not punishment. It was breath. It was woven into the skin like the smell of smoke or the weight of wool. The calluses on the hands were not signs of suffering. They were signs of belonging. To wake sore was to wake alive. Men carved timber and rowed boats. Women hauled water and stirred great pots with arms strong as rope. Children watched, learned, and joined. The body grew into work. There was no need for exercise. There was only life. And life was heavy. But it was also clean, in a way that modern days forget. The sweat earned from cutting peat or dragging nets was not shame. It was truth. When the day ended, it did not wind down slowly. It stopped. Because the body stopped. Limbs that had moved for hours knew what it meant to go still. Joints that had bent and climbed and pulled now straightened. Hands that had gripped handles and ropes now opened, empty. And the ache that followed was not something to fight. It was something to trust. There was no need for sleep rituals. No oils. No music. No stretching. The body was its own ritual. By the time the last mouthful of food was swallowed and the last ember was stirred, the muscles had already begun to fold. Rest did not need to be earned with perfection. It came naturally, like steam rising from broth. And it was not just the physical weight of work. It was the mental freedom from it. Once the labor was done, it was done. There were no late-night ledgers, no chores on glowing screens. There was no list in the mind waiting to be checked. The next day would have its burdens. But the night asked for nothing. Even pain had its place. A bruised shin. A sore shoulder. These were not reasons to stay awake. They were part of the body's long conversation with itself. Pain did not isolate. It softened. It pulled people closer. A mother might rub her child's legs after a day of foraging. A husband might press a warm stone to his wife's lower back. The touch was not medical. It was instinct. Cold wrapped around them, but it was not a cruel thing. It was a reminder. To stay close. To share warmth. To fold tighter. To pull the blanket higher. To let the dog curl nearer. The body understood this language. It spoke it without thinking. There was no perfection in posture. No fear of the wrong pillow. People slept curled on their sides, stretched on their backs, face down into folded cloaks. However the body landed, it knew how to settle. And if a cramp came or the straw poked too sharply, it was shifted, not feared. The body adjusted. It always had. Children did not need coaxing. Their play was not digital. It was running, chasing, climbing, weaving. Their sleep was like dropping a stone into still water. Sudden. Total. Deep. They fell asleep mid-sentence, mid-laugh, mid-supper. And when they woke, it was with hungry joy. Even the elderly, whose joints screamed and eyes dimmed, slept with a kind of peace younger people now envy. Their bodies were tired in a way that no longer asked for explanation. Sleep was not stolen from them. It came like a hand that had known theirs for decades. The body that worked through wind and rain, across frozen hills and through dense pine forests, did not need permission to rest. It only needed stillness. A place to lie. A nearby fire. A roof that kept the snow from falling directly onto the skin. In that stillness, the body remembered everything. It remembered the way the oar felt in the hand, the rhythm of a goat's breath, the sting of smoke in the eyes. But it also remembered how to let go. Sleep was not a new state. It was a return. And in the Viking world, return was sacred. The boat returned to shore. The sun returned to the sky. The child returned to the mother's side. And the body, after giving all it had, returned to rest. There was no need to count hours. No apps. No alarms. No fear that sleep would not come. Because it always did. The body knew the path. The path was warm, worn, familiar. And it waited every night like a faithful animal at the door. So they slept. Not always comfortably. Not always evenly. But deeply. Honestly. Fully. The way a tree sleeps in winter, without shame, without resistance, with full permission from the world around it. And in that sleep, the Viking body became itself again. Not just rested. Restored. The night in a Viking longhouse did not fall in one motion. It layered itself gradually, folding over the day like wool upon straw, until only the firelight moved. Rhythms formed not around schedules, but around people. And people, in those ancient northern spaces, did not treat the night as a void, they treated it as a living companion. Inside the longhouse, the sounds of day faded slowly. The scrape of bowls, the washing of hands, the quiet shift of boots placed near the fire. The last words spoken were often practical, a reminder about morning chores, a muttered blessing, a whispered joke. Then the room grew hushed, not by rule, but by nature. Night was not just for sleep. It was also for softness. A time when things were less sharp. When no one had to prove anything. When the only work left was the slow exhale. Mothers held infants longer. Old men hummed songs with no name. And children clung to the edge of waking, waiting to be told just one more tale. Vikings did not sleep all the way through the night in one long block. Most did not even try. Their rest followed the rhythm of the body and the rhythm of the fire. Sleep often came in two stretches, what we now call biphasic sleep, with a soft, silent space in between. In that in-between, a few stirred. Someone added wood to the fire. Someone shifted, drawing the blanket closer to the chin. Sometimes, a soft conversation broke the quiet. A question about a dream. A whispered plan for the day to come. These moments were not disruptive. They were gentle interruptions, like a leaf brushing water then drifting away. This middle space, between the first sleep and the second, was often the most peaceful. The house was dark. The fire glowed low. Everyone breathed in the same slow pattern. Outside, the wind softened as if it, too, had grown tired. Nothing was demanded. Nothing expected. Some people prayed in that space. Others lay quietly, eyes open, letting the shadows on the ceiling drift like boats. Some turned toward a partner and shared a moment that required no words. This was not wasted time. It was not insomnia. It was rest in its purest form, aware, unhurried, undisturbed. When the second sleep came, it was deeper. The body, having softened once already, slipped back into stillness with ease. It did not resist. It did not count hours. It simply followed the rhythm it had always known. For those whose work began before dawn, the second sleep ended with purpose. They woke not to a sound, but to a feeling, the shift of light, the smell of ash, the quiet call of responsibility rising just beyond the walls. The youngest rose last. Children stirred under layers of wool, cheeks red from sleep, hair tangled like nests. They blinked into the smoky light, not rushed. Waking, like sleeping, was slow. No one used the word insomnia. It did not exist. There were nights when someone could not sleep, but they were not called sick. They were simply tired in a different way. They might sit near the fire, drink warm broth, think, pray, watch the shadows move. Sleep was not forced. It was invited. The rhythm of the night adapted to the seasons. In summer, the dark barely settled. In winter, the dark stayed for half the day. But the people adjusted. Sleep was not a punishment or a cure. It was a partner. You listened to it. You followed it. You did not fight it. The very structure of the longhouse shaped this rhythm. The low ceilings held in heat. The narrow spaces encouraged closeness. There was no such thing as sleeping too far apart. You slept in company, with family, with animals, with ghosts of memory. And that company was part of the rhythm. Some said you could tell a healthy house by the way it slept. If the breathing was steady. If the fire kept glowing. If the floor creaked just once before the deepest sleep set in. These small things became the pulse of the night. And that pulse was steady. It did not beat fast. It did not break pattern. It moved like the tide, like the wheel of the sky, like the quiet footsteps of something ancient moving beneath the earth. Even those who woke before the others moved gently. A bucket lifted. A pot set near the fire. No clang. No crash. The rhythm mattered. It had been learned across generations. It was held in the hands like memory. The longhouse did not command sleep. It made space for it. It did not demand silence. It grew it. And in that rhythm, every soul, young and old, found its place in the dark. So when the night came again, as it always did, no one braced. No one fought. They simply let the rhythm carry them back, breath by breath, beat by beat, into the deep, generous arms of rest. In the longhouse, the fire was never just fire. It was not simply heat, not only light. It was pulse. It was language. It was the beating heart of the night. At the center of the floor, surrounded by stones darkened by decades of soot, the fire lived low and wide. It did not roar unless asked to. It glowed. It murmured. Its breath was slow. And those who slept near it knew its every sound, the soft collapse of charcoal, the whisper of flame licking dry wood, the gentle pop that signaled the next wave of heat. Fire defined space. The closer you were, the warmer the world. Farthest from the flames, cold nibbled at your toes, tugged at your breath. So places around the fire became natural zones, the inner ring for elders and infants, the outer ring for the strong and the young. But every position changed with the night. With need. With kindness. There was no shame in moving closer. No pride in enduring cold. You reached for warmth when you needed it. That was understood. That was human. And in the Viking night, being human meant being warm enough to dream. Every night, someone tended the fire. Not because they were told, but because the fire asked. It asked in the soft slump of a log, in the dimming glow, in the rising chill near the floor. And the answer was a quiet stirring, the lift of a lid, the placing of one more log onto coals already deep with memory. Children learned this rhythm without instruction. They watched their fathers feed the fire with care, their mothers arrange the stones around it just so. It was not ritual, but something older, like hunger or thirst. Something inherited not through words but through watching. And the fire gave back. It warmed food. It dried boots. It lit the faces of storytellers and healed the coldness caught in the bones. Its light danced on beams darkened with history. It moved across the floor like breath. When the house was full of sleep, the fire did not sleep. It glowed in silence. It flickered as if dreaming. Its smoke rose slow and steady through the smoke hole in the roof, joining the night in its long exhale. Breath mirrored fire. You could hear it, from the deepest corner of the longhouse to the space beside the hearth. The slow, even rhythm of breath. Inhale. Pause. Exhale. Sometimes a cough. Sometimes a snore. But mostly, it was quiet, collective breathing. A room filled with lungs moving in the same pace as flame. The fire and the breath, they did not compete. They danced. When the fire shifted, so did the breathing. When someone rolled over and the blanket rustled, the fire threw its light in a new direction, painting a new story on the wall. In this way, sleep was not a break from life. It was part of it. And the fire knew this. It kept time not in seconds but in embers. It counted the night in warmth. Sometimes, when all else was still, someone whispered to the fire. Not in words, exactly, but in presence. A hand stretched out for heat. A body rolled a little closer. A breath caught at the edge of sleep. These were not conversations. They were recognitions. The fire knew who needed comfort. Who had cried during the day. Who had worked harder than they admitted. And it gave what it could. Heat. Light. Company. The fire also held memories. Not just of that day, but of every day before. Smoke from today's fish joined smoke from last winter's soup. Ashes from today's log settled beside last year's pine. The fire remembered. And it gave memory back in its smell, in its warmth, in its smoke that curled through hair and cloak. The breath, too, remembered. It carried the day's rhythm out with every exhale. It released what the muscles could not. It softened what the mind still held. And in the breathing, there was forgiveness. Sleep came easier in this room not because it was quiet, but because it was known. Known by the fire. Known by the walls. Known by the people whose breathing told each other, again and again, we are here. We are safe. We are still. Even when dreams stirred someone awake, they did not startle. They turned toward the fire, and the fire said, go back. And they did. No one feared the dark here. Not when the fire still glowed. Not when the breath still moved. Not when the rhythm was still unbroken. In this world, sleep was not fragile. It was not something to earn. It was not a trick to be learned. It was the most natural thing, because the night made room for it. And the fire kept that room warm. One ember at a time. One breath at a time. In Viking lands, cold was not an occasional visitor. It was a constant voice, always waiting just outside the door, always whispering through the cracks. But it was not feared. It was understood. It was studied. And over time, it became something close to trusted, not for its kindness, but for its honesty. Cold teaches. It sharpens the senses. It pulls you inward. It shortens the day and lengthens the night. It makes the fire sacred, the blanket holy, the touch of another person something closer to prayer. As autumn faded into winter, the longhouse changed. Walls were packed tighter. Cracks were sealed with moss and clay. Furs were moved down from lofts, heavier and thicker than those used in the lighter months. There was no announcement of winter's arrival. The cold simply stayed longer each night, crept in sooner each evening, and eventually never left at all. Inside, everyone adjusted. Layers became habits. Wool was no longer stored, it was worn. Mittens were passed hand to hand. Shoes were wrapped in rags. Children were swaddled until only their eyes peeked through, round and blinking. Cold changed the posture of a body. It made people fold, bend inward, conserve. But it also made them gather. Around the fire. Around food. Around song. In a cold house, warmth was a collective act. If one person shivered, others shifted. If the baby cried, someone pressed closer. Warmth moved like bread, shared, never hoarded. To sleep in a Viking winter was not to sleep alone. They slept in clusters. In rings. The youngest pressed between parents. The oldest closest to the hearth. Animals, too, were drawn in. A goat might sleep beside a child. A dog at the foot. A hen in a corner. Their breath mingled. Their bodies pulsed with the same fragile heat. The fire had to be fed more often. The cold would steal it if left alone. So someone always woke. Added a log. Blew on the coals. Stirred the ash. No one complained. It was not a task. It was survival. And it was done with reverence. Breath was visible in winter. You could see it rise. Curl. Disappear. The children laughed at this, made shapes in the air. But they also learned to read it, the thickness of the fog, the sound it made when sucked through teeth. Cold had language. And in the Viking world, even the youngest were fluent. Blankets were heavier. Furs layered. But the most powerful warmth was still another person. Skin to skin. Breath to breath. Even the sternest warrior pressed his back to a friend when the snow creaked outside. Pride did not survive a Viking winter. Only warmth did. And still, they slept. Not restlessly. Not lightly. But with the full weight of the day pressed into their limbs. The cold outside made the warmth inside sweeter. The ache in the knees made the stillness more sacred. They slept not in defiance of the cold, but in dialogue with it. Sometimes the wind was so fierce that the walls moaned. That the roof shifted. That snow snuck in under the door. In those moments, sleep was a tighter thing, a curling, a gripping, a shared resistance. But it still came. The body still yielded. The mind still softened. In the darkest months, sleep stretched. 10 hours. 12. Even 14. The body followed the light. Or the absence of it. There was no shame in staying still. No guilt in not rising. If the sun had not appeared, then neither would they. They told stories to pass the longer nights. Not new ones. The same ones, again and again. The boy who became a bear. The woman who sewed fire into her cloak. The god who disappeared into ice. Stories were insulation, wrapped around the mind so the cold could not creep in. The dreams changed, too. Longer. Stranger. More vivid. Cold does that, presses images deeper into the mind. In dreams, people walked through snow with bare feet and did not flinch. They rode wolves. They slept inside the bellies of whales. And when they woke, the fire still burned, and the cold still waited. No one asked for spring? Not yet. They endured. They folded themselves into the season like straw into mud, like thread into wool. The cold taught them to wait, to breathe slower, to hold stillness without fear. And so they slept. Through the darkest weeks. Through the deepest nights. With breath like fog and bodies like firewood, quiet, ready, patient. The cold was a teacher. And sleep was the lesson it taught best. In the Viking longhouse, sleep was not something that happened to children. It was something they participated in. From the moment they were born, they breathed the same smoke, felt the same floor beneath their bodies, heard the same hush settle over the room when the fire dimmed. Children were not put to bed, They were drawn into sleep by the rhythm of the world around them. There were no cribs. No glowing mobiles. No lullaby machines humming softly in the corner. Sleep, for a Viking child, came wrapped in wool and closeness. An infant might lie between two older siblings, their breaths synchronizing long before they could speak. A toddler might curl beneath their mother's arm, soot-smudged and soft-haired, already surrendering to rest before the story was halfway done. Children were part of the night. They did not interrupt it. Their sleep was folded into the collective rest of the family, like extra straw in the bedding, like another log on the fire. Their dreams mattered. Their breathing mattered. When one turned in sleep, a hand reached out automatically. Not always a mother's. Not always a father's. Any hand. Any warmth. And the children gave back to the night. Their laughter earlier in the evening softened the weight of the day. Their questions at dusk, about stars, about gods, about why the wind sings in the rafters, echoed in the silence long after their eyes closed. Their small bodies, curled like commas between sentences, gave shape to the night's meaning. The youngest learned to sleep through noise, through story, through snoring, through the muttered prayers of old men and the scratch of dogs' feet across the floor. There was no demand for silence. Sleep came anyway. It came through comfort, not quiet. They were not scolded for waking. If a child cried out, there was no shame. The longhouse shifted gently. A voice hummed. A hand smoothed hair. A blanket adjusted. Then stillness returned. Like a ripple that had passed, not a storm. Their beds were not separate. Sometimes a carved wooden crib might be used in the earliest months, but more often, sleep was shared. Siblings slept together, head to feet, arms tucked beneath shoulders. Grandparents and grandchildren might share space. Warmth did not ask about age. And in the warmth, there were dreams. Viking children dreamed boldly. They dreamed of wolves they had never seen, ships they had not yet boarded, battles they did not yet understand. But they also dreamed of firelight, of bread, of snow melting into soil. Their dreams were not tamed. They were vast. Parents listened to those dreams. In the morning, a mother might ask what the child saw in their sleep. A father might nod if a wolf appeared, or if the sea rose up in someone's mind. Dreams were watched, not dismissed. They were signs, perhaps. Or gifts. Or just stories carried from one night to the next. Sleep was not taught with rules. It was modeled. Children saw the way their elders laid down, the way they quieted, the way they trusted the night. They learned not by command, but by rhythm. The longhouse itself taught sleep, its shadows, its breathing, its warmth. There were rituals, soft ones. A favorite story, always told in the same voice. A scrap of fur pressed against the cheek. A piece of bread chewed slowly before lying down. These rituals were not written, but they were remembered. Passed down like braids, like lullabies hummed without words. And in winter the children slept more. Their bodies knew. The darkness drew them deeper. They did not resist. Even play was slower. Even laughter more muffled. They yawned without hesitation, blinked longer. And when they fell, it was sudden, full, absolute. The way only a child can fall into sleep. They had fewer fears than we imagine. The dark was not empty. It was full, of breath, of warmth, of story. Night was not lonely. It was crowded with care. There were monsters in their stories, yes. But there was always someone nearby to banish them with a word or a smile, or the edge of a blanket pulled higher. The fire was their night light. The dog, their silent guard. The voice of a mother, their anchor. They did not need more. The world was close, and safe, and known. And so they slept. Deeply. Trustingly. Curled like seeds in the earth, waiting for the warmth to return. Because in the Viking night, even the smallest souls were carried gently through the dark. They were not just children of the day. They were children of the night. And the night did not let them go. In a Viking longhouse, the warmth that wrapped around sleeping bodies did not come from blankets alone. It came from presence, from proximity, from breath, from the simple nearness of others. It was a warmth born of necessity, yes, but also of kinship, of trust, of knowing that in the coldest hours, you were never truly alone. No one in the longhouse had their own bed. There were no separate rooms, no private retreats, no distant doors to shut. The longhouse was one body, long and low, dim and breathing. And every night, its heart pulsed with the slow rhythm of shared sleep. People lay side by side, not in rows, but in clusters, woven together by habit and hunger for heat. You might sleep with your brother's feet near your chest, or with your aunt's shoulder pressed against yours. There was no pattern. There was only the comfort of closeness. Between bodies, heat passed like water. It did not stay where it started. It moved slowly, gently, warming a knee here, a wrist there. It gathered where the fire's glow could not reach. And once gathered, it stayed, tucked in beneath layers of wool and fur, within the shared breath of the house. Breath was heat. Every exhale from a human mouth was a whisper of warmth into the air. And in a longhouse filled with people, the air itself became a blanket. You could feel it, not stuffy, not stale, but full. Heavy with sleep. Soft with warmth. They did not fear this closeness. There was no shame in it. Warmth was survival. To pull away from another body in winter was to invite the cold. Even those who argued by day, who kept distance in conversation, lay side by side at night. The body did not remember pride. It remembered comfort. Children lay across laps. Dogs curled between legs. A mother might hold a baby in one arm and press her back to her sister's side. Grandparents were never left alone. Elders were always closest to the fire, their frail heat protected by the younger ones who formed a wall of flesh and wool. The warmth was not just physical. It was emotional, psychological. To feel the weight of another person's sleep beside you was to feel safety. To hear the breathing of others was to know you were not adrift. It was a comfort older than language. In this shared space, dreams flowed differently. They crossed boundaries. They echoed from one sleeper to another. A child might wake and murmur of the sea, and the mother beside her might remember a dream of boats. A man might shift and recall a field of ice, only to hear someone mutter in their sleep about winter. Dreams became communal, too. Not in content, but in reception. In the morning, when people stirred and yawned and reached for their boots, they spoke of what they had seen in their sleep. Not to boast. Not to explain. Just to share. As if the dreams, like the heat, had moved through them all. There was no barrier to this sharing. No dream was too strange. No image too small. A fox with human eyes. A mountain that wept. A fish that whispered secrets. These were spoken aloud as plainly as one might describe the weather. And everyone listened. Because the night was a place they had all visited, separately, yet together. This closeness made the longhouse feel smaller, but in the best way. Not cramped. Not crowded. Contained. Intimate. You could reach out and find someone's hand without thinking. You could murmur and be heard without raising your voice. The space was held in agreement. And this agreement was not written. It was not spoken aloud. It was inherited. A knowing passed down. A way of being together, especially at night. A way of trusting that even in silence you were known. Sometimes two people might lie awake while others slept. They might whisper. They might share secrets. They might simply listen to each other breathe. There was no fear of being overheard. Because in the longhouse, everything was overheard. And that was not intrusion. It was belonging. When the fire burned low and the cold pressed closer, it was this warmth, this closeness, that kept the dark at bay. No talisman. No charm. Just the sure, slow comfort of being part of a living circle of sleep. They did not lock their doors against the night. They locked arms around each other. They did not hide from the cold. They folded themselves around warmth. And in that closeness, in that breath-by-breath sharing, sleep came soft and full. Because in a world built from stone and wind and ice, it was the human bond, skin to skin, story to story, that turned a longhouse into a home. And turned the night into something beautiful. Something shared. When sleep deepened in the Viking night, it was not just the body that let go. The mind, too, loosened its grip. It drifted. It softened. It wandered beyond the rafters, beyond the timber walls, beyond the snow-crusted roof and the world known by daylight. And in that wandering, dreams arrived. The Vikings did not see dreams as nonsense. They did not dismiss them with a tired shrug in the morning light. Dreams were messengers, signs, spirits, warnings. They were not always clear, but they were always respected. Some believed they came from the gods. Others believed they came from the self, the deeper self, the self that did not speak during the day. And so, as breath slowed and firelight faded, the dreams began. They came in fragments, like flakes of ash carried upward on rising heat. They came in waves, like the sea that surrounded their world. They came as animals, as shadows, as songs, as whispers spoken in tongues the waking mind did not know. A fisherman might dream of sailing into a sky of stars, the boat lifting from the sea like a bird. A woman might see a tree that bled light. A child might wake weeping from a dream of wolves with human hands. And all of this was worthy of remembering. In the morning, as sleep released its hold, people shared. Around bowls of warm broth, by the fire as it was stirred back to life, they spoke of what they had seen. No one asked if it was real. That was not the point. Dreams were not judged by truth, but by weight. Some dreams felt hollow, like walking through smoke. Others felt heavy, like iron at the chest. Those were the ones that mattered. A bad dream might mean illness. A strange dream might mean travel. A dream of fire could mean passion or destruction, or both. The meaning was not fixed. It was found in conversation, in community. There were those who listened better than others. An old woman with one clouded eye, known to catch the shape of omens. A quiet uncle who never laughed but who remembered every dream he had ever heard. People carried these dreams with them, not as burdens but as maps. Dreams shaped decisions. A man might choose to delay a journey if he dreamed of storms. A woman might name her child after a figure who appeared in sleep. A family might hold back from harvesting if a dream showed the soil bleeding. These choices were not made lightly. But they were made. Because the dream was part of the world. And the longhouse itself knew these dreams. The walls had held generations of sleeping bodies. The roof had echoed with countless murmurs, gasps, cries. The floor had felt the turning of dreamers wrestling with visions. The smoke above had carried the exhalations of sleepers who had seen beyond. The fire, too, listened. It flickered in response to whispered names. It flared when a story was told aloud. It shrank when the words faded, as if resting with the rest of the house. Fire and dream had much in common, hard to hold, impossible to ignore, full of meaning if you knew how to look. Even the animals dreamed. Dogs twitched in sleep, paws running across unseen fields. Goats shifted and sighed, their breaths slow and rhythmic. The rhythm of dreams moved through every living thing under that roof. It was not a gift given only to humans. It was part of the breath of the longhouse. Some feared their dreams. Not because they were weak, but because they knew dreams could wound. A vision of drowning, of loss, of flame, these stayed in the bones long after waking. But even fear was not shameful. It was named, shared, held. The night gave these dreams, and the morning gathered them. But some dreams stayed silent. Some were not spoken. They sat behind the eyes of the dreamer, still glowing faintly like a coal buried in ash. Not all dreams were ready for air. Some needed time. Some needed distance. Some never left the dreamer, never fully let go. Still, the house made room for them. For all of them. The shared ones, the whispered ones, the silent ones. It did not require confession. It only offered space. Dreams, like sleep itself, were not goals. They were not hunted or forced. They came when invited, when the house had grown quiet, when the fire no longer danced but hummed. When the breath of many had become one steady rhythm. Then, and only then, did the door to dreaming open. And the people stepped through, one by one, carried by smoke and silence into a world that did not need daylight to be true. Because in the Viking night, dreaming was not an escape. It was a return. In the Viking world, sleep was never the same from one season to the next. It changed as the sun changed, as the wind shifted, as the snow fell or the earth thawed. The night was not a fixed thing. It stretched or shortened. It warmed or froze. It arrived early or crept in late. And the people, in turn, adapted. They moved with it, like the tide. They let sleep find its own rhythm. Summer was brief, but bright. The light lingered long into the night, sometimes never leaving at all. In the far north, The sun merely skimmed the edge of the sky, a long golden twilight that refused to end. Sleep in summer was a gentler thing. It arrived later. It asked for patience. Children played longer. The fire was smaller. Windows, if the longhouse had them, might be opened to let in cool air. Blankets were thinner, the furs put aside. The heat of bodies, so treasured in winter, now became something to ease, to manage. People lay farther apart. Still close, but no longer clinging. The longhouse breathed differently in summer. The air inside was lighter. The scents were of sweat and greenery, and the sharp edge of iron. People came in from the fields with hands stained by soil, with cheeks flushed from the sun. They slept less, but not poorly. The body knew how to shift. Dreams were shorter in summer. Brighter. Filled with movement. The sea appeared more often, as did birds and distant shores. People dreamed of journeys, of new lands, of sails stretched wide by warm wind. These dreams were not softer, but they were faster, more urgent, more alive. In autumn, sleep began to deepen. The days shortened. The fire grew louder. The longhouse returned to its inward breath. Furs were brought down. Bread was baked thicker. Herbs were hung to dry. And sleep arrived sooner, heavier, with the scent of wood smoke and the soft rustle of dying leaves. Autumn dreams were filled with preparation, with gathering, with goodbye. The harvest lived in the sleep of those who had gathered it. The weight of the season pressed gently on every chest. And then came winter, long, dark, sacred. In winter, the sun bowed out early, and sometimes not at all. The world turned inward, and sleep grew long. People slept 12 hours, sometimes more. Not out of laziness. Out of wisdom. The earth slept too. The animals slept. The trees stood still. In winter, people wrapped themselves in layers. They clung again to each other. They welcomed the night like a guest who had come to stay for a season. Sleep was no longer a break. It was a way of life. Dreams in winter slowed. They grew quiet, vast. They spread like snowfields across the mind. Time lost meaning in them. One could wander through a single dream for what felt like days. Faces from the past returned. Memories restitched themselves into new patterns. The fire was never allowed to die in winter. It became a second sun, and the longhouse circled around it. Sleep was deepest in those coldest months. It was a surrender. It was a shelter. Spring brought the softest sleep of all. A mix of exhaustion and renewal. Bodies shook off the slowness of winter. The light grew longer each day. Dreams returned to the earth, to mud, to root, to rain. People stirred more often, woke earlier, stretched with the same uncertainty as sprouts beneath the soil. In spring, the longhouse opened, not fully, not foolishly. But the people began to lift their heads. Sleep became lighter, easier to wake from. But still it was respected. Still it was offered. Still it came with a kindness earned by patience. Every season taught something different. Summer taught rest was possible even in light. Autumn taught how to let go. Winter taught how to wait. Spring taught how to begin again. And sleep, always sleep, became the way these lessons sank into the body. In the Viking world, you did not fight the season. You let it shape you. You let it tell you when to wake and when to lie down. You listened to the dark. You followed the sun. You measured your breath against the wind. And in doing so, you slept well. Not because you controlled sleep, but because you trusted it. Because the seasons knew what the mind did not. And the night always kept the secret. Not all Viking sleep happened beneath a turf roof, or beside a family fire. Some sleep drifted on salt water, rocked by wind, wrapped in wool, surrounded by creaking timbers and the breath of the sea. For the Vikings were not only farmers. They were sailors, traders, raiders, wanderers. And sometimes sleep came aboard a ship, beneath the oars, between one horizon and the next. The sea was not still. It did not hush for sleep. But it offered something else, rhythm. A constant motion that spoke to the body the way a lullaby speaks to a child. Rock. Rise. Sway. Settle. It was not comfort, but it was known. And what the body knows, it learns to trust. The longship was open to the sky. There were no walls to shield against the wind. No thatched roof to muffle the dark. Only the curved belly of the boat, the stretch of the sail above, and the hands of the men beside you. There was no bed. No straw. No fire. Sleep came where it could, beside a bench, under a wet cloak, against the smooth wood ribs of the hull. And still it came. The men took turns resting. Watches were kept. Eyes scanned the waves for signs of land, or threat, or omen. But between shifts, sometimes only minutes at a time, sleep was seized like bread in a hungry hand. A man might crow beside a coil of rope, head resting against his shield. Another might tuck himself between sacks of grain, his body bent like a question mark. Sleep had no form. It fit the shape of need. The cold at sea was sharp and constant. It cut through wool, through bone, through silence. But the men were used to it. They wrapped themselves in layers, wool soaked with salt, cloak stiff with wind. They leaned against one another. They did not speak. They did not ask. They simply folded into themselves and let the sea hold them. There was no fire. No flame to gather around. Only breath. Only closeness. Heat passed between shoulders, under arms, through shared blankets. A shoulder became a pillow. A chest became a wall. And when the wind eased, when the sail sagged and the boat grew still, the silence was more complete than any room on land. Dreams at sea were stranger. The boundary between the waking and the sleeping blurred when the world swayed beneath you. A wave could be dream or reality. A seagull's cry might echo in both places. Many said the gods were nearer on the water. There were no walls to block them. No roofs to muffle their voices. They came in sleep. They came in silence. And the sea kept those secrets. It swallowed heat. It swallowed names. But it gave sleep in return, deep, sudden, sacred. Or wild and loud, like the storms that rolled over the horizon without warning. A man might wake with a gasp, hand gripping the edge of the ship, not sure what world he was in. But he would sleep again. They always did. Some men kept tokens with them, charms carved from bone, bits of fur, pieces of cloth from home. They tucked them under their cloaks, beside their ribs. Not to ward off sleep, but to anchor it. To remember where they came from. The sea had a way of making men forget. And so, sleep became a memory as much as a need. It was the memory of the longhouse. Of the fire. Of the voices of children at the edge of dreams. It was a memory of safety. And sometimes, that memory was enough. Sleep came in fragments. It came in shadows. But it came. And when the ship returned, when the coastline rose like a promise in the mist, it was the sleep they remembered most. Not the battles. Not the trades. Not the distant stars. But the way the waves had rocked them, the way they had breathed in unison, the way the sea had held them for a time. They returned with salt in their hair and silence in their eyes. They returned with sleep in their bones. Because in the Viking world, sleep was never dependent on walls or fire or comfort. It came where the body was ready. And even out there, beyond land, beyond home, beneath the oars, beneath the sky, sleep still found them. Before sleep, there was always a story. It was not asked for. It was expected. A shape in the evening, like the setting of the sun or the piling of firewood. In a Viking longhouse, the story was the seam between the day and the night, the final thread before rest could begin. Children waited for it with wide eyes. Adults listened quietly, even if they had heard the same tale many times before. Storytelling was not entertainment. It was warmth. It was medicine. It was the braid that held family and memory together. The storyteller was not always the same. It might be an elder, voice gravel-thick with age. It might be a mother, hands busy spinning wool even as she spoke. It might be a young man with a strong voice, eager to keep the room's attention. But the story did not belong to the speaker. It belonged to everyone. It was spoken aloud, not read. There were no books. Only memory, and the shape of a voice. Some stories began suddenly, with laughter, with gasps, with names that came like lightning. Others unfolded slowly, like a blanket drawn over shoulders. And around the story, the fire danced. Its light flickered on walls, on faces, on the tools hanging from rafters. It glinted on braids, on teeth, on the steam rising from bowls still half full. It twisted and stretched with every change in the tale, as if it, too, listened and reacted. The children always curled in closer. Even the ones who pretended not to care, who whispered to each other during the start, fell silent before the middle. Eyes heavy, heads resting on arms or legs or the bellies of dogs. The story wrapped around them like fur. Sometimes the stories were of gods, loud and fierce. Thor throwing his hammer. Loki's shifting shape. Odin walking among men, cloaked and silent. These stories made the fire jump. They filled the longhouse with awe. Other times, the stories were smaller. Of a lost boy finding his way home by the scent of bread. Of a woman who sank to the sea and was answered. Of animals who knew more than they let on. These stories made the room feel tighter. Closer. Safer. And sometimes the stories were true. Or close to it. Of battles fought. Of journeys taken. Of storms survived. These were told quietly. Without pride. Just memory passed from one mouth to the next. The story ended when the fire grew still. When the words slowed. When the breath of the house changed. No one announced the end. It arrived like snow, soft, quiet, complete. Afterward, there was a silence deeper than before. A silence that held the shape of the tale just told. A silence that invited sleep, not as a demand, but as a gift. Sleep came easily after a story. The mind, once full of image and sound, loosened its hold. The body, once curled in attention, unfolded into rest. Even those who had planned to stay awake a little longer found themselves slipping under. And the dreams that followed often carried echoes. A hammer. A song. A pair of glowing eyes. The story walked beside them into sleep, uninvited but welcome. The storyteller lay down, too, their voice now still. Their breath joining the rhythm of the room. No applause. No thanks. Just the knowledge that the thread had been passed, once again. Because in the Viking longhouse, story was not just a thing you heard. It was a thing you slept inside. It was the fire before the quiet. The map before the dream. The song the night hummed as it pulled the blankets close. The sky in Viking lands did not ask permission. It swept in without apology, fierce, sudden, untamed. Rain did not knock. It crashed. Wind did not whisper. It sang through the cracks in the wood, curled around beams, slipped into cloaks. And snow did not fall gently. It pressed, heavy and wide, sealing doors, hiding paths. The weather was not background. It was the author of everything. And when night came, it came shaped by that weather. There were no forecasts. Only instincts, signs, stories. The way birds flew, the ache in old knees, the color of the clouds. The longhouse was built not just to hold the family, but to stand against wind, to shoulder snow, to breathe even when the air grew too thick to move. And inside that house, sleep was not just an act. It was a conversation with the sky. In deep rain, the sound filled the longhouse like music. Drops on turf, on timber, on hide. Not random. Not chaotic. But steady. Measured. Comforting. Like 1,000 soft footsteps around the edge of the world. Children listened for patterns. Elders listened for changes. The rain lulled them, pulled them downward. No one feared the water. Not while the roof held. In wind, the house shifted. Beams groaned. Smoke tilted sideways. Blankets lifted. The fire flickered unevenly. And yet sleep still came. The wind was fierce, yes. But it was also distant. Outside. And the contrast made the inside feel safer. The warmth more real. The breath more necessary. People pulled closer. Words were fewer. And the rhythm of the storm became the rhythm of their rest. In snow, the world grew smaller. Softer. The sound vanished. The outside disappeared. It was like sleeping inside a shell. A cave. A hush made of sky. Boots were left by the door. Coats hung heavy and frozen. And the air inside the house turned to breath and wood smoke. Sleep came thick in snow, not fast but deep. The kind of sleep that blurred the edge between night and day. The weather outside dictated everything. Where they lay. What they wore. How long the fire needed to burn. How tightly they wrapped the infants. How much space they gave to the old woman with the fragile lungs. Nothing was planned without the weather in mind. Because the weather was never separate. Even in dreams it arrived. A storm might chase someone through the mind's landscape. Snow might fall in a memory. Wind might howl through a story. These dreams were not frightening. They were familiar. The sky always walked with them. Sometimes, the weather turned cruel. A sudden frost that cracked bones. A wind that lifted roofs. A hailstorm that bruised the livestock. In those nights, sleep was more than rest. It was defiance. It was hope. A way of saying, we are still here. We are warm. We are breathing. The youngest learned early not to fear it. They were taught the names of clouds, the shapes of storms, the stories of great winters past. They were told how to listen, how to feel the shift in pressure, how to know when to bar the door. And when the storm came, they did not cry. They watched. And then they slept. The adults watched longer. They stirred the fire more often. They checked the corners for drafts. They moved sleeping bodies closer to the hearth. They were not afraid. They were alert. The weather demanded attention. But not panic. And in the worst of it, in the long howl of a blizzard, in the sharp crack of thunder over the fjords, there was still time for story. For lullaby. For a hand reaching out in the dark. Because sleep was not separate from the world. It was part of how they endured it. The longhouse held. The people breathed. The fire lived. And outside, the sky did what it would. But inside, sleep settled like snow. Heavy. Quiet. Total. A surrender not to fear, but to trust. Because even in the wildest weather they knew. The night belonged to them, too. In the heart of the Viking night, there was something stronger than the fire. Something warmer than the firs. Something deeper than the longhouse timbers. It was the bond between people, quiet, steady, invisible, forged not in battle or celebration, but in sleep. When the world outside vanished into snow or fog, when the fire dulled to its softest breath, the closeness of others became the most precious thing. Arms touching. Shoulders resting together. Breath heard without seeing. These were not accidents. They were instinct. In sleep, the pride of the days slipped away. The tasks, the rank, the labor, all softened. A chieftain and a shepherd lay feet from one another. A hunter and a grandmother shared the same warmth. No one demanded privacy. No one was turned away. At night, all were simply bodies seeking rest. The bonds that formed in this shared darkness were not loud. They were not always named. But they lasted. A man who had wrapped his arms around his brother through a winter storm would not forget. A woman who had comforted her sister's child beneath the creaking beams would always be remembered. Even disputes could fade in the night. Anger lost its edge beside sleep. Cold hands found forgiveness more easily than heated words. In the morning, nothing needed to be said. The silence had already spoken. Children knew no other way. They were born into this closeness. They learned comfort from the press of a cousin's heel against their hip. From the sound of a father's snore. From the soft muttering of dreams beside them. Their trust was not taught. It was absorbed. The old ones understood this best. They knew that sleep was not just for healing the body. It was for holding each other. It was the only time everyone truly stopped. Stopped talking. Stopped working. Stopped remembering the weight of the world. And in that stillness, bonds thickened like stew in winter. Friendships deepened under the fur. Lovers grew tender without touch. Grief softened in the presence of steady breath. You could cry into the dark and find no answer, yet still feel less alone. Because someone else was there. Always there. Even strangers found peace. A guest welcomed for the night was not left alone. Space was made. A blanket was offered. No questions asked? The rules of hospitality were simple. If the fire burns, if the roof holds, then you belong. In this closeness, trust was not a decision. It was a condition. Trust existed not because it was earned, but because it was required. You had to believe the person beside you would not turn away in the night. Would not hoard the warmth. Would not let the fire go out. And most did not. The bond was mutual. A shared breath. A shared silence. A shared promise, spoken in the slow rhythm of lungs and the creak of wood. The longhouse breathed, and its people breathed with it. In the darkest nights, when storms screamed or sorrow hung heavy, It was not the strength of one that mattered. It was the quiet presence of many, lying side by side. Not solving. Not fixing. Just existing. Together. Even in dreams, the bond remained. A man might see the face of the one who lay beside him. A woman might dream of a voice that was still whispering into the pillow. And in waking, these dreams lingered, like warmth in the blanket. Bonds were tested, too. Someone might leave. Someone might not return. But their space remained, remembered in the curve of a cloak, in the gap near the hearth, in the shape left in the hay. Grief lived in these spaces. But so did love. And when a new child was born, when a traveler joined the fire, when a lost one returned, the longhouse shifted, stretched, made room. Because the night had taught them, there is always room. For breath. For warmth. For each other. The bond of the Viking night was not written in rune or carved in stone. It was shaped in silence, held in sleep, tested by cold, and confirmed by every slow inhale in the dark. And so they lay, not just to rest, but to remain. Not just to sleep, but to belong. Morning did not begin with a bell. It began with breath. With a slow shift of limbs beneath wool. With the gentle creak of wood, the hush of ash being stirred, the first cough from the old man near the hearth. It began when the fire, low but not dead, glowed faintly enough to remind them the world still turned. The Vikings did not leap from sleep. They rose like the sky, gradually. One by one. No alarm. No rush. The longhouse woke in layers, like frost melting from rooftops. The children stirred first, often before they opened their eyes. Then the women, already reaching for cloaks, already gathering thoughts before words. The men rose slowly. Some sat before standing. Others turned toward the hearth before doing anything else, as though to ask it a question. The youngest of them fetched water, still blinking. The oldest of them wrapped themselves tighter, waiting for the warmth to return. There was no judgment in rising slowly. It was not laziness. It was rhythm. The body moved when it was ready, and readiness was not determined by a clock, but by the light outside and the warmth inside. And that warmth, it lingered. Not just in the fire, but in the breath of those who had slept beside one another. The body remembered the night before, the softness, the trust, the surrender. Morning did not erase it. It carried it forward. The air smelled of ash, of wool, of skin, of smoke held gently in hair. There was a scent of bread if someone had begun to stir the dough early, or of broth if the bones from the last meal had been left to soak. It was a scent that promised continuation. That life did not begin anew each day, but moved forward from the last breath of night. Voices were low. There was no need to speak loudly. A greeting might be a nod, a glance, a soft hand placed on a shoulder in passing. Words came later, with the fire's first crack, with the sound of water being ladled from the barrel. The first task was tending the hearth. Always. The embers never fully died, but they needed attention. A hand stirred the coals. Another added wood. Flame followed. It always did. And with it, the day truly began. Not all woke happy. Some woke stiff. Some woke sad. Some carried dreams they had not yet shaken. But all woke together. And that togetherness shaped the day. No one was left in the cold. No one was forgotten. Even the quietest breath was counted. Children began to speak first. Asking questions. Telling parts of dreams. Trying to remember if what they had seen was real. Parents half listened, smiling softly, tucking in cloaks, brushing hair with fingers. Their answers were not always clear. But they were always present. The old ones were listened to next. If they spoke of a dream, people paid attention. If they remained silent, others respected it. Age carried weight. Morning was gentler for those who had seen many. Food came soon. Simple, warm, filling. A bowl passed hand to hand. A crust broken and shared. Eating was part of waking. It was not rushed. It was done as the room grew lighter. And that light, it changed everything. It crawled in through the cracks, turned the smoke golden, painted faces with softness. It reminded them of time. Of tasks. Of reasons to rise fully. But even with light, there was no rush. The day waited. The world outside was still there. But the world inside, the longhouse, the fire, the breath, remained whole. Morning was not an exit. It was a slow turning of the wheel. The place where they had slept was folded, blankets shaken, cloaks gathered, but not as if the night were over. As if it had been honored, respected, as if it had done its part. Because sleep, for the Vikings, was not just about rest. It was about return. To self. To rhythm. To each other. And so, when morning found them, it did not wake them with noise. It touched them. Softly. As if to say, "You have been held through the dark. Now rise. And hold the day the same way." So now, as the last embers fade and the longhouse settles for one more night, let the quiet carry you. The Vikings have laid down their tools, folded into furs, and slipped beneath the weight of darkness, not with fear, but with trust. You have walked through their world. You have felt the snow, heard the wind, seen the flicker of flame on timbered walls. You have breathed beside them, dreamed beside them. And now, it is time to rest like they did, slowly, deeply, fully. If this journey helped you feel a little calmer, a little warmer, I invite you to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps me bring more of these soft, quiet histories to life. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from, and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing the quiet corners of the world come together here, one sleepy soul at a time. Now dim your lights, pull the blankets close, and let the crackle of fire guide you the rest of the way. Sleep well. You are safe here. You are home.